Hey, man, you heard my opener about the CBC walking back its reporting, its claims following essentially a threat of litigation from Alberta's premier. What do you make of this story? What do you think the implications are?
This is a tough one. The thing is, mistakes in journalism happened on a regular basis. It's just that 99% of their stories will be okay, but it's that 1% that they will miss, especially if it's on a premier or a prime minister or a cabinet minister. These stories will have legs, and I know a lot of people in journalism that don't like this one, but they have to carry it, they have to bury it, and they have to live with it now. It happens. I mean, the analogy that I can have is posters sometimes miss the mark, and what do? They don't abandon. They try to correct the course, they try to improve themselves, but it will leave a mark for sure for a little while, because of course, Madame Smith, she still was, attacked by the commissioner of ethics, right? So she's not entirely clean, but she will take that as a W for sure.
While we're talking about Danielle Smith, why don't we go there first? The Angus Reid Institute releasing numbers this week, taking a look at which provincial premiers are, essentially winning the trust and in some circumstances, admiration. I mean, some of these numbers are pretty impressive. Yeah. Looking at Saskatchewan in particular, of their electorate, and other premiers are really struggling and might be in a little bit of trouble. What jumped out at you about the numbers in Alberta? How's Danielle Smith doing?
Well, Danielle Smith won the election just over a month ago, and we know that many Conservatives were reluctant to vote for her, but they still did. I mean, the UCP went from 55% in 2019 to just over 52%. So the base held strong, but we know a lot of Conservatives held their nose and figured, you know what, it's better than the alternative. I don't want to go to the NDP. So Madame Smith's numbers are not as high as she would want to. But right now she has 4 years in front of her, so she has the benefit of time, and not all politicians in that list of premiers has that luxury. We saw that Doug Ford in Ontario is also back to his pre-pandemic numbers in the 30s. So there are some premiers in hot water right now in this country. We see that Monsieur Legault is still doing well in Quebec, but his numbers, of course, have come down from the Soviet-like numbers that we saw during the pandemic. But for Danielle Smith, I think this is very early in their new mandate. She has time to correct the course. She could forge her own UCP identity from now, and I'm looking forward to see how it goes. That was a very strange election campaign, especially, I guess, from outside the province.
We got to look at political approval ratings a little bit differently than, as students or parents, we might look at report cards. Like, let's say, for example, Scott Moe, based on these numbers, the most popular premier in Canada in the month of June, still just 57% approval. If you bring home a report card with a bunch of 57%, depending on the household, your parents might not be thrilled. But in politics, flirting with 60% is pretty darn good, right?
It's amazingly good. Even, I would say, even high 30s is pretty good.
High 30s?
The last one. Yeah, high 30s is enough to win an election in Canada usually.
Yeesh.
And if you look at that list, who's in last place? It's Miss Stefanson with 25%. And the latest polls that we had out of Manitoba, as you know, there's an election coming in October in Manitoba. This election is a toss-up.
Premier Higgs, I think that, New Brunswick, the Maritimes don't always get a lot of attention. Fair to say? They don't always get a lot of national attention. I mean,
they did in the last few months. New Brunswick did. But,
yes. And that's what I want to get into with you, right? We're talking about parents' rights and education. We're talking about legislation. Are we on the same page here, Philippe? Is this what you're talking about? Maybe you can tee that story up for us. This is, I think, a story where Conservatives have, ardent Conservatives have been impressed with the steps that Conservative government has taken with regards to preserving or restoring parents' rights in education. They want parents notified, essentially, if young students under the age of 16 are making any amendments or changes to their name or to their gender representation, to pronouns in schools. I'm probably missing some important points here, but that's the gist of it. That's the Cole's notes here. It's earned him favor with the party loyalists, but generally speaking, you think it's hurting his numbers with 28% approval?
Oh, absolutely. And it's very dangerous for any government to tread that water because these are very emotional issues. And even though usually the base of your party will like when you go into a culture war, when you go into a culture war or when you change the subject, your education system is failing or your health system is having problems. Well, let's change the subject and talk about transgender kids in schools because this is far more emotional. And any government of any color, sometimes they do this, they change the subject, but Mr. Higgs is playing with fire here, and I would not be surprised. We have an election in New Brunswick next year. We'll see how those numbers go, but he's banking on keeping that 35% that voted for him last time.
Dennis on our live chat says, how the heck is Scott Moe so popular? What is it about Saskatchewan's premier that has him almost all the time at the top of the list?
Well, it's the new one-party province. I have to say we do not have much data out of Saskatchewan for many reasons. It's 1.3 million people, so it's a smaller province. And also, since the Saskatchewan party is leading by so much over the competition, the NDP, we have very few polls there. But Mr. Moe, he has a way of speaking to his constituents, and he won the election very easily 3 years ago, should I say? And of course, he's the favorite to win next year. So as long as the NDP in Saskatchewan and other places in the country keep their focus on the urban folks only, they will have trouble winning elections. The NDP in Alberta, we could talk about that too. Yes, they won both cities, but had they won just a few more seats in the regions of Alberta, this election could have been, a 42, 45 seat, and then suddenly it's highly unstable. Yeah. The NDP did not win anything in the Edmonton donut, and they finished with 39 seats. Had they won 3-4 more, you would have an unstable government, and maybe the NDP would see an opening eventually. So I guess it's the same thing in Saskatchewan, but of course the cities are much smaller with respect to the population of the province.
Before we get to David Coletto's numbers, Abacus data's look at the federal vote intention. We don't have time, obviously, to go through all the provinces and territories, but what's one other storyline, or what's one other number that kind of jumps out at you? I'm looking at Houston polling at 55 in Nova Scotia. Awesome. Obviously, as you said, a bit of a dip for François Legault in Quebec. There's David Eby in BC, relatively new premier-ish, with 45% approval, kind of neck and neck with Alberta's premier Danielle Smith. What's one of the stories that's really jumping out at you?
We could do a whole show on British Columbia right now, and the fact that the former BC Liberals seem to have completely failed their new branding. They had poor results in the by-election, and in the polling that we see right now, they're in the high 20s, and whereas the NDP is in the high 40s, and they appear to be cruising to next year to a re-election. So this is one of the stories that I will be looking in the next year. Mr. Eby seems to be in good shape for next year. But aside from that, if we go to the federal numbers, Ryan, I've seen some very contradicting opinions online regarding the polls, and I'd like to say something because yes, if we look at the latest polls, the federal polls, we see CPC +5, +7, +6, +8. I'm looking at the list right now, but you have to look at the regional numbers because the Conservatives seem to be leading nationally right now. But when you break it down by regions, you see that they're doing relatively okay in the Maritimes, although the Liberals are still leading. The CPC is nowhere to be seen in Quebec. And in the latest Abacus data poll, we see that the Liberals are leading by 3 in Ontario. And so that means that the Conservatives are running up the score where they don't need it. Once again, we heard this before in 2019, in 2021. So it may be very good for public financing for those polls, maybe for publicity, get you many clicks. But when you break it down in our region right now, if a vote was being held and those numbers held, it would be a reduced minority for the Liberals. Justin Trudeau would still be prime minister. So Pierre Poilievre, for as good a campaign he had during his the leadership campaign, has not been able to grow the Conservative coalition. I'm not saying he won't ever do that, but in his first year as a Conservative leader, he has not grown the Conservative coalition.
But this has been, you could just swap out Pierre Poilievre's name and swap in Aaron O'Toole and Andrew Scheer and Candice Bergen, right? I mean, hasn't this kind of been the story for the federal Conservatives ever since Stephen Harper left? Not left. I mean, he lost an election to Justin Trudeau, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. You're right. It's just that at some point, the Liberal government is in its 8 years, soon to be 9th year. Justin Trudeau's personal numbers have dipped. Government unsatisfaction is high. We've had stories about Chinese interference, and yet those two parties are almost tied. And so the Conservatives should be in a position right now to take down the Liberals. And right now we see that maybe they could squeak out a very short minority. And then what would they do? Would they do a coalition with the Bloc Québécois? That's not happening. Yves-François Blanchet is not in the business of making Ottawa work correctly, especially not with Conservatives who are at 16 or 15% in Quebec. So he's not going to do that. The NDP is going to support the Conservatives? No way. So, and there's no a grosse coalition like in Germany. The Liberals or Conservatives are not going to work together. So this is going to be a very interesting fall, because right now, yes, the Conservatives have good polls, but when you break it down by region, it's not that good.